Um, Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and the invitation to speak here today. I'd first like to offer my thanks to yesterday's speakers for their endurance. I must admit I sat there very cowardly thinking I'm really glad that I'm not trying to tackle the heat that you did yesterday. So I really commend the start that you gave us and the energy and enthusiasm, and I am selfishly relieved that we are a little cooler this morning. As maybe was suggested in the introduction, this interest of mine is a little bit of a side road as we do go down, and it came about. Well, it's probably been with me my whole life, but it came about in the pandemic acutely. I spent much of lockdown in Spain, where there were requirements to be masked all the time. And I got used to that, as many people did. And I was out running one day, and I realized that on the one hand, I was protected from some unpleasant smells that I experienced when running. To be crass, dog poo and things like that were no longer a problem for my overactive nose. And at the same time, I saw blossoms on the trees and realized that I was also not experiencing that. And I was reminded of it yesterday when we were directed to look at the red skin and the chilies and the idea that pain is that touch is something that can be painful. And I had to admit that I was completely preoccupied with the fish. I can't stand the smell of fish. I don't have synesthesia, but I offer you that simply as what I learned in trying to find textiles that we understand more through smell than through touch, was how extremely slippery this is. What one person smells, another person doesn't. These things are constantly shifting away from us, even in ourselves. I think most of us will recognize at different times in our lives, or simply at different times in our health, our sense of smell seems to shift and change as well. So bear with me. I'm not getting anywhere solid with this one this morning. But as we already touched upon yesterday, we have an awareness of the fact that we sort of overweight our attention to some of the senses. And when it comes to textile scholarship, there's often been quite a push that we need to pay more attention to how we experience the textile through touch. It's often how designers work. It's the thing that the screen strips away from us. And that tends to be the narrative in textile scholarship, is let's not only look at these things through sight, but look at these things through touch. It becomes a big question in curation and museum, how museums deal with these objects. But of course, scent is there as well, more so than I think we realize. This is a really brilliant book by Hussein Hsu, The Smell of Risk, Environmental Disparities and Olfactory Aesthetics, and he just nails all of the problems that I came across in trying to trace these things. They can be lifted up, but we're probably very unlikely to agree on what they smell like. So Hsu writes, thus the human body's most sensitive tool for detecting invisible chemical threats across space. He's quite preoccupied with air pollution and how this is something that lands in different communities, socioeconomic communities differently, and at the same time can't be controlled. But his description is deeply ambiguous, fraught with uncertainty, socially constructed, culturally neglected, and this I must admit is a big red flag and an interest to me, and resistant to representation. So I must admit that I need help from our colleagues who are far more techie than I, as far as how this meets the virtual interests of this this event, but certainly this idea of scent in some way being resistant to representation. From someone who comes from literature, I hate to admit that, and I also find it quite tantalizing. This was also touched upon a little bit yesterday, and this is something that I sit with a bit of discomfort with, this idea that asking people to pay more attention to scent within textile practices also actually maybe exacerbates a lot of the stereotypes that textile practices already suffer from. And so these are, this comes from a big edited anthology. Klausenhausen, Sinnott write, increasingly, that if sight increasingly became associated with men, who as explorers, scientists, politicians, or industrialists were perceived as discovering and dominating the world through their keen gaze, and they're very much talking about colonial mapping here, then to include, this is my voice now, to include smell in our understanding of textiles compounds some of the associations that have long dismissed the discipline as non-serious. Smell, in turn, was now considered the sense of intuition, sentiment, homemaking, seduction. We have a whole perfume industry, all of which were associated with women, and I also believe then a lot of those stereotypes with cloth. Just as an aside, I do know that being a professor of craft is, for some people, an absolutely hilarious academic title. For other people, quite intriguing. It's very particular to Scandinavia and Northern Europe, but I meet these stereotypes all the time, and instead of coming from a position of saying they don't exist, I actually find them interesting, and some of the research, the carceral research that I'm doing at the moment, instead of trying to wipe them out, is much more interested in how the textile navigates, particularly because it's often underestimated. That is another conversation, but I try to play with that a little bit here. I do think these observations cut across European languages generally, but if German is different, then I'd love to hear about it. But at least in English, my language, we don't have many words that are actually about a scent. We tend to say that something smells like something else. Musty, acrid, dank, it's a really unpleasant one. But in general, the English language doesn't have particular words for smell. Other languages do, but I think this is also another bit of urban myth. I was born in Wales, and allegedly the Welsh language, which I don't speak, but the Welsh language is meant to have an astronomical number of words for green, because that's the landscape, but it's not actually completely true. It's a lovely idea, but it doesn't actually quite tally either. If German is different, I'd love to learn about it. And as I said, so somebody coming from textiles and literature, on the one hand, I can't believe this idea that we can't communicate or that language fails us. Language failing us is a hugely popular topic in craft research, which I stand out alone and say, no, we just have to find better language. But of course, I do understand it from an embodied perspective. So this is early American writing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the yellow wallpaper, highly feminist narrative, but a real evocative explanation of what this scent might be doing in the character's experience. If you're not familiar with the story, it's actually based on Gilman's own personal experience, what we might now today diagnose as postpartum depression. But she is being somehow saved by her wonderful husband by being kept in the attic, where she ends up in dialogue with the surroundings, and particularly with the wallpaper, either to escape the confines that her family has put her in, or maybe actually to escape the confines that society has put her in, expecting her to be a happy mother and wife. As I said, I love to test this idea that language doesn't entirely fail us. So here we have this creeping scent that Gilman offers us. It creeps all over the house. It's hovering, skulking, hiding in the hall, lying in wait for me. It gets in my hair, which I'm sure some of us can relate to. I don't smoke cigarettes, but I still remember a time when there would have been a smoking and a non-smoking section on a flight, and as a non-smoker, it's in your clothing in a way that you're not used to because it's not your habit. And then it's also something that's dynamic, that's moving around. And she does then evoke something synesthetic when she says, the only thing I can think of is like the color of the paper, a yellow smell. Gilman's, this is pretty troubling to read. She does publish on why she chose to write this, and it's this really, really devastating medical diagnosis for a woman that she was meant to just calm down and stop stressing herself. She really needed to step away from the books, step away from the pen. And she points out here that this nearly killed her. It definitely wasn't her cure. It nearly killed her. But I like to offer it as a really sort of accessible way to think about the fact that, and wallpaper I'd like to offer as sort of a very close cousin to textile design, that these things are far more active than we think about. But as I started to look into this topic, I came across another set of references which I didn't have a chance to publish on because, of course, you always find them after you've hit send. And it made me realize that even I probably, in reaching to other senses, was looking for something, unfortunately, I'm going to use that absolutely dreadful word, something more authentic. Which I know is utterly, utterly fraught and a completely dangerous thing to even stand on the stage and say, but that our senses somehow are more legitimate in our associations with things. And so I was fascinated to come across a whole set of references to scent actually being used in a very dishonest way in textile manufacturing. So the first one here comes from the UK. Imitation muslin, branded as Imperial muslin, was infused with scents in an effort to suggest authentic production of Dhaka muslin, which by the 1780s was being produced not only in Bengal, but in the factories of John Lean and Sons in Glasgow, Scotland. The manufacturer would insert traditional spices such as cardamom and cinnamon into the folds of the cloth, so that when the English public opened the cloth, they'd think it was from India. And this really started me thinking about how I think we're at a time where we're reaching for an expanded access to the senses. But as was said yesterday with the work with the gaming and trying to move more towards something that was real, why not actually take it in the other direction? I made some loose connection here to this, that scent is actually being used in an utterly, utterly dubious way here to authenticate dishonestly manufacturing. And then we have Harris Tweed, a concept that coincided with the emergence of the arts and crafts movement, and Ruskin, who promoted local crafts to counter the rapid industrialization of the 19th century. In 1857, fabric from Harris was already so famous that in Glasgow, a smelling house had to be built. Imitation tweed, so not coming from the islands, could be inoculated with the smell with which the tweed was always associated, the earthy tang of peat fires. So the Scottish islands and Ireland, the island of Ireland as well, burn peat that has a really pungent, it's also part of their whiskey tradition. So an earthy tang of peat fires in the weavers' homes. So they were, again, artificially building this scent into mass manufactured cloth and selling it as something a little different than it was. And then my final example of this is batik. I lived in Indonesia as a child, and I have a particular interest in batik cloth, and there are a couple of ways that it can be made. Different types of print traditions, of course, at this point in time, all sorts of copy traditions as well, and a hand production which uses different types of resist, but one is a wax. There are also other types of pastes, but one is a wax, the most common. Batik cloth patterned by hand uses this wax, and during Dutch trade, it's a long story, but the Dutch began to make batik that they then tried to sell back to Indonesia, what became independent Indonesia. Lots of different reasons, including taxation, why that might not have worked, and that's how it ended up in the West African dress traditions today. But nonetheless, that scent of the wax continues to be how a hand-drawn tulis batik is one way that it can be authenticated today. There are other ways to look at it in the pattern, but this idea, you're in a market and you smell the cloth rather than study it optically to authenticate it really gets my imagination. And so again, here we have another example of mimicking that scent to pass off something that's industrially manufactured as real hand-drawn batik. And researchers today can continue to note that at least some people, when they're buying batik, would smell it as much as study it to decide if they're really being sold the real McCoy. So I offer those as diversions because I've had to sort of get back on my own heels, that on the one hand, what I smell isn't what you smell, and what I smell today also isn't necessarily what other people in the room would agree on. I'm endlessly complaining about things that nobody else can smell, so this is my internal dialogue to myself. And then, of course, it also gets used in these really dubious ways. So here we have the Korean artist Mi Kyung-shin presenting these artifacts. And this is the installation. So the crates would have been included in the exhibition. These absolutely extraordinary objects. The crates would have things like fragile on them, so you're also a little bit set up to believe that you're in the presence of ceramics or porcelain. And I'm avoiding that word for good reason, because these are made of soap. They're replicas made of soap. And Mi Kyung-shin's practice has long worked with creating these absolutely exquisite replicas of museum-quality artifacts. What the screen takes away from us, and what the screen takes away from this whole talk, of course, is that you might get a little bit of a tip-off as you walked into the gallery. You could, some of us might be able to smell the soap before you begin to realize that she's got this whole setup on the viewers as far as what is it that we value. And when I said these things are astonishing to look at, they don't break in the same way. So how is it that culturally and from a museum collection point of view, we land some things with value and not others? This is a rather different aside. Sugar Floor Dance is made by a British artist, Linda Florence, who was first studying the reality that a lot of carpet pattern making is motivated by concealing dirt. I often think about this in hotels. What an astonishingly awful carpet. How could they possibly have chosen that? It's just making my head scream. And any hard-wearing surface, it's often actually about making it so jumpy that it stops some of the tracking and stops some of the dirt being so visible. So Florence flipped all of this around. She uses sugar, the same sugar that you would dust onto a cupcake or something like that, onto the floor, and hired professional ballroom dancers to dance the waltz, a very set pattern of itself, which then, of course, scuffed her beautifully oriented pattern. I have not had the chance to experience this in person, but apparently the audience after a while could taste the sugar in the air because it's kicked up by the dancers' feet, and one pattern is overlaid by another pattern. I am conscious of time, just a couple more. Ernesto Neto was one of my memories that also started me. So once I started to realize my incredible relief that I could go to the Spanish grocery store and not be completely overwhelmed by the fish counter because everyone was meant to be wearing a mask, I then started to try and remember if I had examples, if I'd experienced examples of textiles that had a scent with them. And it drew me to an extremely early memory of an exhibition. So the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego lent me these images from a 2015 installation, but the installation I saw was in early 2000s, a really, really old memory. He packs this stretchy material with different spices, and they change over time. And again, my memory of this exhibition was that I had to leave. Like the scent was so incredibly overwhelming. But he also is interested in activating something that isn't only optical. These things are always changing because the color bleeds in a certain way through the stretchy material over time. And my last example is Doris Salcedo, a memorial, a piece of art like much of her work that is a memorial, in this case, to a nurse who lost her life. And Salcedo wanted to try and create something that offered the care that this woman was denied herself and had her life offered to others until she was murdered. And so you're looking at rose petals that are sutured together. Salcedo is an extraordinary, eloquent artist herself, and she talks about trying to suture these rose petals together was almost like the challenge of creating an adequate memorial for this woman, or remembrance for this woman. They kept on trying to break apart. You know, she felt materially as though she was looking for something. Its impossibility might have been part of the point. Maybe you can just see the sutures are the same as medical stitches would use. The interesting thing about this work is it's also always changing. I'm sure that this has to partially do with if you experience the exhibition on day 1 or week 6. And again, as I said, because we're all calibrated differently to these things, but reviewers go all over the place with this type of work. So we have a description that it smells earthy, or a faint honey floral, or a smell that doesn't make sense unless you've been in the presence of the dead. That makes a good connection to the reality of what the work is about, but that again would really depend on what our associations are. As I started to read more reviews, you will also come across a lot of reviews where people will say, this was an olfactory exhibition and I smelt nothing. It is extremely risky way to work. Sorry, I lied. One more. Arcebispo de Rosario was another Brazilian artist who had an extraordinary life. He was a boxer, he was in the Navy, and he spent much of his life in a mental hospital. He felt that he had been asked to prepare for the second coming of the Lord, and he needed to archive things. So you have lists of names, images of all of the types of ships he could remember. He was preparing a record using the bed sheets from the hospital and raveled yarn, blue threads from the uniforms. Absolutely, I think, optically exquisite for you to look at on the screen. But this is Julia Bryant-Wilson warning us in, I think, a really, really adept way of some of the risks around how we treat this type of work. So she points out that some of the blankets have stains or stamped with the name of the hospital. When on display in the 95 Venice Biennale, the garments had been worn as daily uniforms were so odoriferous, they had to be laundered. Indeed, since it first began circulating in the contemporary art world, Bispo's work has raised questions about what it means to clean up his history, to extract his creations from the state apparatus in which they were made and redefine them as art. That part of it, I think many of you will have other examples of. That's something we're more familiar with. But are we imposing a decontextualized aesthetic framework onto these pieces, or are we elevating them to their rightful place? And I need to add into that now even the idea of stripping out their scent or laundering them so that the public then experiences an alternate version. I think that this is another example of something where we're often held back from the reality of a lot of these things. And of course, this screen and this talk is the perfect example of I'm not bombarding you with any of these things. But I leave you with that question of how many times is there something else going on in scent that all of our other types of research and capturing and things later on strip out. And that's not the history that we record. So thank you.